NHL Free Agency, a tradition like no other. It's the peak of the summer, you're tuned into TSN's 8-hour frenzy, there's intrigue, there's drama, there's excitement. There's so much talent, so many difference makers on the open market, waiting for a new place to call home. It's a chance for teams to add that one missing piece, that player that will complete the rebuild or get you over the hump. On July 1st, where we're so far removed from even remotely being on the ice, there are winners and there are losers. There are teams that are turning heads, making splashes, and putting the league on notice. But when the puck drops for the season 3 months later, none of this matters. In fact, winning free agency actually may be more of a detriment than a benefit. Because here's what nobody tells you about July 1st in the NHL. You can't win the cup on that day, but you sure can lose it. Okay, I get the excitement with free agency. Chances are you just watched the team that isn't yours lift the cup. You want to figure out how your team can get there, how your team can beat them. And in theory, there's so many players available that can strengthen your team. But excitement is only temporary, and I'm here to see whether these big free agent hauls actually translate to winning. So let's begin by taking a look at the last 10 years, the so-called modern NHL, if you will. Every year, there are teams with boatloads of money to spend that aren't afraid to hand out big contracts when the market opens. And oftentimes, they're coined as the winners of free agency. So, how do these winners perform the very next season? I compiled the top 3 spenders in free agency for each of the last 10 seasons and looked at their performances the following year. And the results aren't very encouraging. 67% of the time, these teams actually saw their point total decrease the following season after spending big in free agency. And 60% of the time, the teams in the top 3 spending failed to make the playoffs the next season. And if you want the ultimate example of free agency disaster, you don't have to look very far. 1 year ago, the Nashville Predators, Boston Bruins, and Seattle Kraken all spent over $100 million on free agents. And none of them were even close to making the playoffs. Nashville's frenzy was headlined by a trio of Steven Stamkos, Jonathan Marchessault, and Brady Shea, while the Bruins spent big on 2 Canucks, Elias Lindholm, and Nikita Zadorov. And Seattle added 2 recent Cup winners in Chandler Stevenson and Brandon Montour. These were all signings of veteran players that were supposed to bring an instant boost to these teams. The Predators were coming off a 99-point season where they put up a tough fight in round 1 of the playoffs as a wild card. And after securing these 3 veterans, there were talks of a short Cup window in Nashville. But in the 2024-25 season, the Predators were 31 points worse than the year before, scoring the second fewest goals in the NHL. Stamkos had his worst season from a points per game level since his rookie year in 2008. Marchessault scored at his worst rate since 2015-16, a year where he was still splitting time in the AHL. And the 2 big-time forward additions shared the worst plus-minuses on the team at -36 and -29, and Brady Shea followed shortly thereafter with a -26. And if you thought a 31-point drop-off was rough, the Boston Bruins were somehow even worse. After a 109-point season in 2023-24, the Bruins attempted to squeeze every drop out of the orange by adding some solid veterans in 2024 free agency. Elias Lindholm was a center they needed for some time, and thinking of a 6'6" Nikita Zadorov in a Bruins jersey was already drawing mini Zdeno Chara flashbacks. The Bruins had some tough injury luck, but a 33-point drop-off to finish bottom of the Atlantic, selling your captain at the deadline to a division rival, and then talks of a rebuild being associated with the current state of the franchise, for a perennial playoff contender, that's pretty rough, especially after spending $105 million in free agency. What's frustrating about these situations is free agency is supposed to be the quick fix. You don't have to give away any assets like you do in a trade, and the guys you sign are supposed to have an impact far sooner than the players you draft. Plus, there's far less unknown. So, why does this seem to be a trend? Well, for starters, the A+ level franchise cornerstones rarely hit free agency. Crosby, Ovechkin, McKinnon, never close. Connor McDavid? Oh, actually, that might be a bit of a touchy subject right now. Anyway, so the free agents that are available aren't typically franchise-altering talents. However, once they hit the open market, oftentimes a bidding war drives up the price. These players secure fully guaranteed contracts with lots of term, and often don't even end up seeing the end of these deals. Let's take the 2016 free agency class, for example. The best player that was set to be available was Steven Stamkos. But unsurprisingly, he re-signed in Tampa just 2 days before free agency began, and he never hit the open market. It was then headlined by Kyle Okposo, coming off a 64-point season with the Islanders. dominant power forward Milan Lucic, 30-goal scorer Louis Eriksson, captains Andrew Ladd and David Backes, and other solid contributors. While strong players at the time, so much money in term was handed out in this window, and it's now remembered as one of the biggest contract disasters in free agency history. In fact, of the 8 largest contracts where players signed with a different team, 4 of those deals had to be traded with an asset just for the other team to take on a contract, and 2 of the players were bought out. And as for Kyle Okposo's 7-year, $42 million deal with the Buffalo Sabres, he would go on to eventually become the team captain and would essentially play out that entire deal. However, it resulted in the Sabres making the playoffs a grand total of 0 times, and Okposo won the Stanley Cup immediately after being traded. So it's safe to say the last 10 years of big spending hasn't exactly gone to plan. But a lot of this data, aside from our 2016 deep dive, doesn't provide a lot of context on who or what these teams are spending their money on. And a lot of the analysis solely focuses on the team's performance just the next season, since we're calling free agency the quick fix. But free agency signings, especially the big money ones, can also have a much longer impact on an NHL franchise. And not in a good way. I think this is a good place to start. On July 4th, 2012, the Minnesota Wild celebrated Independence Day by signing 2 of the biggest American stars in the NHL to identical 13-year, $98 million contracts. And I think it has to be said that both Parise and Suter were very good players for this team, but the fact of the matter is, this team never got past the second round with these 2 in their roster, and the team's currently riding a 10-year playoff series win drought. Oh, and GM Bill Guerin decided to buy out the remaining 4 years of both of their contracts in 2021, meaning the Wild are paying dead money against their cap for both Suter and Parise until 2029, almost 20 years after the original contracts were signed. And in the last 2 seasons alone, the Wild have been paying almost $15 million for both Suter and Parise to not even play for the team. A pretty tough situation when trying to re-sign and build around a star like Kirill Kaprizov. In 2011, the Rangers dished out a 9-year, $60 million deal to star forward Brad Richards, who'd been a consistent point-per-game player in both Tampa and Dallas so far in his career. But in New York, his scoring efficiency dropped every single year, and they bought out the remaining 6 years of his contract in 2014. His contract was set to be paid out over the next 12 years, which means he's still counting towards their salary cap for 1 more season. And who could forget the Leafs signing David Clarkson to a 7-year, $36.75 million deal just a few months after blowing a big Game 7 lead to the eventual Stanley Cup finalist Boston Bruins. Clarkson was supposed to be the missing piece of grit and toughness that the Leafs needed. And he also had a 30-goal season in his repertoire. But in Toronto, it was a complete disaster, as Clarkson recorded just 15 goals and 26 points in 118 games as a Leaf. After less than 2 seasons, the team traded him to Columbus for Nathan Horton, a great player in his prime that was unfortunately suffering from a degenerative back condition that was set to keep him from playing ever again. Horton never did suit up for the Maple Leafs, so essentially it was a cap maneuver to dump his contract with the Blue Jackets. And what becomes even more interesting is the lengths that the Blue Jackets had to go to get rid of Clarkson's deal. Ahead of the 2017 expansion draft, the Blue Jackets offloaded the contract of a now injured David Clarkson to Vegas. In order for Vegas to take this contract though, the Blue Jackets had to send them a 1st-round pick in 2017, a 3rd-round pick in 2019, and agreed for the team to take William Karlsson in the expansion draft instead of some of the other unprotected veterans. Well, Karlsson obviously went on to become a Golden Knights legend and a player that Columbus wished they would have kept. But this gets even better when you look at what Vegas did with that 2017 first-round pick. The Golden Knights agreed to another deal with the Jets to take UFA Chris Thorburn in the expansion draft, essentially ensuring the Jets don't lose a single player under contract. In order to do this, the Jets had to swap first-round picks with Vegas, moving the Knights 11 spots up in the draft and allowing them to select Nick Suzuki, who was eventually traded to the Montreal Canadiens. So yes, correlation isn't always causation, but the sequence of events is just too funny that I have to ask the question. Was the Leafs signing David Clarkson to one of the worst contracts in free agency history the first domino in allowing the Canadiens to get their captain and best player, Nick Suzuki? And if you love a full circle story, you'll be happy to know that the Leafs actually traded to get David Clarkson's contract back in 2020. So he did finish out that 7-year contract with the Maple Leafs after all. Maybe it wasn't such a bad deal. If you paused and took a look at the biggest spenders chart earlier in the video, you may have noticed Calgary in 2018 is a big outlier. After an 84-point season, they saw their point total increase by 23 after spending $110 million in free agency. One of their biggest signings was forward James Neal, who signed a 5-year, $28.75 million deal with the Flames. Neal had just turned 30 years old and had begun to show some signs of regression, but he was still a 25 goal scorer and a consistent 40 to 50 point player. But unfortunately for Calgary, this signing had very little to do with the team's Pacific Division title winning season, as Neal recorded just 19 points in 63 games with the team. And come playoff time, Neal was healthy scratched in a must-win Game 5 where the Flames were upset by the wildcard Avalanche in the first round. He was then sent to the rival Oilers for Milan Lucic, another tough contract, and the Oilers would buy out Neal in 2021. And speaking of the Oilers, has free agency spending been part of the reason they've lost in back-to-back Stanley Cup finals? Goaltending has been an issue for the team for a while, and they thought they had their solution when they signed Jack Campbell coming off an all-star season with the Leafs in 2022. Campbell couldn't bring over that all-star form over to Edmonton, and after posting career worsts in both save percentage and goals against average for 2 straight seasons, Campbell's rocky time in Edmonton ended after just 39 starts when the team bought out his contract with 3 years remaining. Cap penalties paid by the Oilers because of the Jack Campbell buyout and the previously mentioned James Neal buyout cost the team roughly $3 million this past season. So, why does this matter? Well, the Oilers were in a very tough cap situation this past offseason where they decided not to match 2 offer sheets from the Blues to their 23-year-old RFA defenseman Philip Broberg and their 22-year-old RFA forward Dylan Holloway. Both players were high draft picks and had shown a lot of promise. But the Holloway contract in particular carried an AAV of just $2.29 million per season, meaning had they not been still paying for Jack Campbell and James Neal, they could have kept a player that posted 63 points in 77 games this past season. I think that's the guy they would have wanted against Florida. Now, there has to be a why somewhere in all of this. Why are there so many trends of mass free agency spending causing more bad than good? Because in theory, it should be the quick fix. There shouldn't be any growing pains like building through the draft often brings. There shouldn't be years of adjustment or years of waiting to see success. It feels a lot more simple. When you add a highly sought after veteran to your team, it should lead to an increase in win total. So why isn't this always the case? To understand that, we first need to look at the types of teams that often go on to win the Stanley Cup. Is there a trend or behavior that more often than not constitutes winning? And I think the answer is yes. If you examine the recent era of Stanley Cup winners, it's very rare that any of the top earning players on these teams were signed in free agency. Several of the multi-cup champions, the teams that define this era of hockey, the Blackhawks, the Penguins, the Lightning, the Kings, all of these teams assembled their cores through the draft. The Avalanche had years of suffering to acquire McKinnon, Landeskog, Makar, and Rantanen. The Capitals had years and years of failure with their drafted core, but stuck with it before finally winning the Cup in 2018. There was never a need to spend crazy in free agency. Sure, it can fill in gaps here and there, but the primary organizational philosophy is about development. The only real outliers are our 3 recent years of Stanley Cup champions, the Vegas Golden Knights and the Florida Panthers. And they built their teams by making some incredibly timely trades to secure top-end talent on their rosters. And of course, it's worth noting that the Panthers acquired their star goalie, Sergei Bobrovsky, through free agency, giving him a 7-year, $70 million contract in 2019. But what makes this an even more interesting conversation is that this contract was widely regarded as one of the worst deals in the NHL for the first couple seasons. So Bobrovsky was even backing up Alex Lyon in the playoffs just 2 years ago. So if cups aren't being won on July 1st, why are they being lost? What's different about the teams that are spending? And why isn't this leading to more long-term success? Professional sports is currently living in an era of impatience. Coaches are being fired left, right, and center, and young players are being traded when it feels like they haven't been given time to develop. Everything needs to be instant. With general managers facing the heat, free agency feels like an easy way out. You just missed the playoffs? You just lost your star player? What better way to get ownership and the fans off your back than a quick, fancy splash in free agency? A one-stop shop to help meet an expectation rather than seeing things out the long way. Because in the NHL, winning isn't bought, it's built. It's hard enough as it is to win a cup, and it's even harder to do so when bad contracts are weighing you down. Free agency forces you to pay a premium on a diminishing asset, often an aging player who you not only overpay for in year 1, but in the 6 years that follow on that deal. Couple that with a relatively stagnant salary cap in the NHL in the last decade, and it's a recipe for disaster. So when July 1st comes around this year, I'm not here to tell you can't be excited about your team getting a new shiny toy. There have definitely been some great free agency signings in NHL history. But for every Marian Hossa, it feels like there have been 10 David Clarksons that unfortunately didn't pan out. And maybe this year's free agency class will be different. But I think we've seen enough of the true winning blueprint. So for now, I'll stick with the belief that winning is built through patience, development, and smart asset management. Because the teams that win in July usually lose in April.